I apologise both for looking like a bit of a freak today. There was nothing dramatic, I'm afraid. When you reach my age, you basically have to get out of bed at the wrong way and everything stops working. And I also apologise for the technology troubles with the webcasting and the podcasting and the fact that my computer isn't working. We will soldier on and do a decent job today, I hope. So 2 things to begin with. First, I want to remind you that I have office hours today from 3:30 to 5:30. My office hours have been a bit messed up because we've had lots of talks going on a Tuesday afternoon, but I shall be there for the full 2 hours today, and I'd love to have the opportunity to meet those of you I haven't met before. The other thing I wanted to say is that to remind you that you can put suggestions, requests on the chat room of BSpace for music to listen to. I'm coming out of the era of playing you just white guys playing guitars from the 1970s, and this is your chance to educate me in good British music that I don't know. Okay, so let's begin this lecture, Revolution in Government in the 19th Century. My last 3 lectures, which I know should have been about 15, surveyed the long 18th century from the Glorious Revolutions, even through to 1714, down to the Napoleonic Wars. And the basic argument that I was trying to get across to you was that Britain's ancien regime, this system dominated by a monarchy, an aristocracy, and an established Anglican church, ironically, or paradoxically, catalyzed the emergence of new ways of thinking about the organization of political, economic, and social life. And one of the remarkable things about that process was that this new imperial state that grew up during the 18th century on top of this ancien regime found ways of nesting those processes within it. So I ended the last lecture, I think, saying, look, in 1815, Britain's ancien regime looks basically the strongest of any in Europe at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And yet, that very system had created a set of processes that would appear to threaten and undermine it. So today, I'm going to carry on talking about different types of revolutions. And today I want to talk not about the type of high political revolution that was the Glorious Revolution or the economic revolutions that I was talking about last week, but I want to talk about a revolution in the form of government that happens in the 19th century. And I'm going to suggest that new forms of governing happen for 2 reasons. The first reason builds on those lectures last week and says, look, you need new systems for governing a radically different type of society, so that the type of society created by rapid population growth and increasing mobility meant that we had a new type of society, what Adam Smith called the society of strangers, and this required new ways of projecting power and authority. The old ways of having power and authority mediated in person, in particular localities, were being displaced because you now did not know necessarily the people that you were governing over. The second reason is that this new system of government comes out of the radical and enlightened critiques of the ancien regime. It develops ideas about a new rational and scientific form of government. And it's the application of those ideas, in large part, we'll be tracing today. Final point, before I get to the introduction proper, I'm going to characterize these new forms of government that emerged in the 19th century as liberal, with a small l, lowercase. And I want you to remember that definition of liberalism that I gave you in the very first time that we met. So by liberalism, I'm not talking about the thing that Berkeley is apparently famous for. It isn't about being cool or hip or open-minded or thinking of yourself as socially or politically progressive. The liberalism that I'm talking about grew out of this critique, this critical engagement with the institutions of the 18th century. And it came to be characterized in the 19th century by a belief in free trade, by a belief in rational and representative forms of government, in the rule of law, and the idea of individual self-improvement, and the creation of a meritocratic system that would bring advancement and prosperity to all of those who deserved it. Now, remember what I said to you in the very first class, that the challenge in this course is not taking those things that you think look instantly recognizable and thinking, oh, I know what the rule of law is. Oh, I know what rational representative forms of government are. The liberalism I'm about to describe to you, and these forms look radically different from the systems that you think of in those terms today. Okay, so let me give you still yet introductory comments to this lecture. Historians of Britain are basically very fond of discovering revolutions in government. In fact, I think that you could now say every century since the 16th century has its own revolution in government. Historians have claimed, oh yes, 16th century, yes, here's a revolution in government, 18th century, oh yes. So what is at stake there is an attempt to try and mark out the emergence of new capacities of the state, the ability of the state to be able to do new types of things and to extend the reach of its power over ever greater distance. And lastly, what's at issue in these claims about revolutions in government is the way in which state power was justified, the ways in which this extension of state power was justified, how it made claim to a certain type of legitimacy. Now, it's going to be my suggestion to you today, as I've said, that the new type of state emerges basically between roughly the 1820s and the 1880s. And I'm going to suggest to you it was a characteristically modern type of state and a distinctly liberal one. In fact, I'm going to say that it's the foundation of the type of state that still predominates in much, well, certainly in Britain and in much of the Anglo-speaking world. And it emerges, note, during a period of peacetime, broadly speaking. There's lots of colonial wars, and I'm going to come to those in a minute. But basically, this state develops not out of the exigencies of war, not out of the necessity of raising taxes or waging war, but out of a challenge of governing its population and its territory in peacetime. So what made this a modern, or indeed a liberal type of state? Historians have basically had a variety of answers to this. Okay? On the one hand, they say, well, look, the key issue here is that the state becomes more representative. Okay? You have the passage of this thing called the Great Reform Act, which you'll learn about next week, that reforms the electoral system, that enfranchises the new industrial bourgeoisie in the new industrializing areas, and then Parliament responds to their demands and begins to introduce a whole series of measures like the Test and Corporations Act, Catholic Emancipation, the Reform Act, the New Poor Law, municipal reform, Corn Laws, Navigation Acts, all the old system basically wiped out between 1828 and the repeal of the Navigation Acts in 1849. In other words, this is a story about how the state just gets better and better because it's more representative of the people it governs. The second argument is that it's not so much about how representative the state was, it's about how rational it was, about how scientific it was. And here, the influence of this old, in fact not old, dead man pickled in a box in University College London, Jeremy Bentham, stands very, has a central place. University of College London, by the way, was formed in 1826 as the first secular university college. So it enabled nonconformists and dissenters to be able to attend university for the first time, remembering that they were barred by the ancient universities. Now, Bentham's great idea was that reason, not custom, not history, should be the ordering principle of making government efficient. And it wouldn't just make it efficient, it wouldn't just make it, making it rational wouldn't just make it efficient, it would make it more effective to improve the quality of human life. And that meant displacing basically all the old systems that were structured around the power of the monarch, the church, and the aristocracy. Another answer that historians have given is, well, it's just about how the state becomes cheaper. That the state was enormously expensive during the 18th century, hence all the rise of those new forms of tax collection to wage war. And the real shift is that you have a peacetime state that gets rid of all of the old corrupt offices and places and pensions that had characterized the old system and basically became a much cheaper and more efficient state. And people were willing for that state to do different types of work, to do more types of work, because if it wasn't costing them, they were cool with it. And finally, in this list of slightly conceited explanations for the growth of state power, was the idea that the real miracle about the British state was that it uniquely, in the European context, avoided revolution. The revolutions that had swept the continent of Europe in the 1830s and the 1840s ended at the English Channel, that the British state held firm because it was more representative, it was more rational, it was cheaper, etc., etc., etc. I'm not a fan of any of those types of explanation, and so I'm going to give you some alternatives here. The first thing I'm going to be arguing to you today is that far from the state receding and becoming cheaper and more efficient, basically smaller, which is what the idea of the Victorian laissez-faire state that you've been reading about with Eric Evans was predicated about. Actually, the opposite is true. That what you see in the 19th century is a massive growth in new forms of governmental power that became insinuated into the very fabric of people's everyday lives in an unprecedented type of way. And that many of those new forms of state intervention were designed to compel people to become what I'm going to describe as a liberal subject, a good, civil, rational, ideal citizen. This is what I'm going to describe to you as the rule of freedom, a whole new series of rules for how it is you have to behave to become free, that the state helps implement. Second point I want to emphasize today is to broaden the story out a bit by saying, look, the British state was not simply a state forged in this cozy domestic context of the British Isles. Actually, many of the new forms of state power and of governmental action were pioneered across the British Empire. And that shouldn't, in a way, be surprising, because the British Empire didn't stop expanding at the Congress of Vienna. 1815 wasn't the end of Britain's imperial reach. In fact, it colonized Singapore in 1824, Shanghai and Hong Kong after the Opium Wars in 1841, New Zealand in 1840, Natal in South Africa in 1843. So actually, this period of the 1820s and the 1820s through to the 1840s is one of quite significant imperial extension. And in that process, the British state had to find new ways of governing those localities, bearing in mind that they were, as you can see from this map, very, very distant from the imperial centre. Now, to justify these new types of interventions, both in Britain and across the colonies, you had to have a new principle of government. And key here, I'm going to suggest, is the idea that government took increasingly scientific and disinterested forms, that government was beyond politics. It was no longer lodged in the authority of particularly charismatic individuals, be it a monarch or a local aristocrat, and it was no longer linked in to a series of interested forms of corruption, where you serve the government in order to get a pension, and that you were appointed to that type of position. The key shift that I'm going to describe to you here is that government becomes about trusting in rational bureaucratic procedures. It no longer becomes about trusting in the authority of individuals in localities. And the final point, I've just realized I've been talking for almost 20 minutes and I haven't got out of the introduction. The final point I want to emphasize is that this process creates, ironically, because you think it's going to create a centralized bureaucratic machine, you know, in London, and it does, and I'm going to show you how it does that, but it also perversely reanimates local and personal forms of power. In other words, this isn't a story about the simple forward march of a new type of bureaucratic state. It's a little more complicated than that. So let me flesh out a little more what I mean by this rule of freedom, because it's pretty important to this lecture as a whole, and it's a phrase that I borrow from the advisor that trained me as a graduate student. It's his term, not mine, so I'm almost a form of plagiarism. So last Thursday, I was talking to you about this enormous social transformation created by an increasingly mobile and expanding population. And what I want to emphasize today is that what that meant in terms of the influence of power and authority was that it could no longer be understood or relied upon that the old figures, the priest, the landlord, even the employer, would necessarily know the individuals that they claimed authority and power over. We created increasingly a type of society of strangers in Smith's terms. And therefore, the old forms of personal authority were much less effective. This was also true of the church, which was paralyzed by its fear that the church no longer exercised authority over the population. And that was particularly the case in the new industrial cities, or the growing urban areas where there just weren't as many churches built. So in the 1851 religious census showed that only 1 in 5 people attended church in London. And the vast majority of those were, of course, the working poor. I mean, the vast majority of the people who didn't attend were the working poor. The other point I want to make here is that remember how the 18th century had no centralized police force, how it was dependent upon the imperial state was dependent upon basically a pretty mobile militia that would run around the countryside on horse, putting down riots at the beck and call of the local magistrate. That system is displaced in 1829, and it's displaced by the creation of a new metropolitan police force. And not only a metropolitan police force, i.e. for the city, for London, but a police force directly under the control of the Home Office. So in the old days, if you had a local watchman or constable, they would be employed by the local parish and the parish officers. Now, London was seen to be so important that it had a police force that was controlled by the centre of government. And indeed, it gets its own offices in New Scotland Yard in Whitehall, as we'll see shortly. Nonetheless, the key thing that I want to emphasize to you, even though you get, and local, sorry, one other thing I need to say here, local towns, i.e. towns, provincial towns outside of London, also get the ability to create police forces through the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835, and then the countryside get the ability to do that with the 1839 Rural Constabulary Act. Now, so, in one level it seems, okay, so the state's getting itself organised, is that right? Back one. It's getting a police force out. But the point I want to make here is that these police are like a very rare type of bird, for a bird spotter. They're very, very thin on the ground. So the Metropolitan Police Force is basically just 4,000 strong in 1841. Actually, it's 4,300. That's one policeman every 900 inhabitants. Okay, that is not a big police state. Birmingham, another big city, has one policeman for every 610 members of the inhabitants of the city. Manchester, a little further north, has one for every 840. So the police is basically not thickly populated, and as you can see from these figures here, in 1848 even, 22 of the 171 boroughs, the towns, still had no police force, and by 1853 almost half of the counties, the rural counties, still had no police force. So I think that you get the point. So the type of government that comes is not necessarily based upon the ability of the state to enforce its will violently. Instead, the key feature of the new types of government that emerged in the 19th century is the attempt for government to become internalized, for individuals to live the rules that the state wants them to live by. This means basically the creation of a new type of person, the projection that if you can be this ideal liberal individual, if you could be a civilized subject, then you could avoid the strong arm of the state. And there were basically very easy ways of doing that. You could have good moral character. You had to be industrious and self-improving. You had to be able to support your own family, as in this deeply romantic image of, the fat patriarchal figure with his happy wife and children around him. And you have to be informed and independent as a citizen. You had to be able to think for yourself and be above the possibility of bribery or corruption. Now, the point is that if you could become close to that type of person, you were promised to be supposedly free of government, free of the strong arm of the state. But the point that I'm trying to make to you is that freedom in this definition is not about the absence of rule. Freedom is not about not being governed. It's just that you're being governed in a different type of way. Okay, that's a difficult concept, but I hope it will become easier to get when I get into the specific case studies that I'm going to explore momentarily. So let me talk about this other key feature of how it is that this new system is legitimated by talking about the new science of government that emerges. How are your hands? Holding up? Remember, you don't necessarily have to get everything that I'm saying down here. Hopefully this podcast will be working and it's something you can go back to at a later date. Okay. So remember when I was talking about the emergence of the fiscal military state in the 18th century? I talked about the way in which it was layered on top of the existing forms of government and the existing forms of jurisdiction that existed. Okay? And I talked about the 18th century state being a type of composite state made up of these very different types of elements, from the very centralized excised office to the locally based, parish personified by the justice of the peace or the local aristocrat or gentry. That stuff doesn't go away. That's still all there throughout much of the 19th century, although it's going to become less and less important. But on top of this, on top of those old highly decentralized structures, you get a new type of centralized bureaucratic system. And I'm going to suggest to you that that system gave the state unprecedented knowledge about its population that it governed and the territories it sought to control. And in doing so, it transformed the nature of the state, so that, again, the state was something that was anonymous and distant. You didn't necessarily know, you couldn't represent it in terms of a single individual, as you could in the past. So let me give you 3 examples of how that might have manifested itself. The first is the example of taxation, because I'm sadly fascinated by the history of taxation. Remember, in the 18th century, that all forms of tax, whether it was land tax or whether it was excise or customs, was collected and often negotiated in person. The excise collectors had manuals and rules that they were meant to follow, but basically personal encounters with your tax person and often forms of negotiation, particularly over land tax, were not uncommon. The introduction of income tax changed all of that. And I say this, I'm filling out my tax forms at the moment. Income tax is first introduced in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars to try and bring more money for the war effort, but it lasts just 3 years. It runs from 1799 to 1802. It's not reintroduced until 1842. And the key thing about income tax is that it creates it's not that there's 2 key things. Obviously, income tax is important because it's a gradated form of taxation, and it's not a tax on sales, which tends to hit the poor most heavily. That's one important element of it. The other important element is the system of collection. Okay, so now what you had just if any of you have filled out taxation forms today, you'll know you have a series of schedules of paperwork that you have to fill out. It's a bureaucratic process. You fill out forms, you send them in, you never meet the person who is taxing you. They remain utterly anonymous to you. It's a completely blind bureaucratic process, if you like. And this is the system that was introduced in Britain in 1842. Remarkably, that entire system of paperwork was operated by just 361 surveyors and inspectors by 1870. Okay? Contrast that to the 2,000 plus excise men that were running around the country collecting tax in the first decade of the 18th century. Now, I don't want you to think that all taxation suddenly becomes bureaucratic and by form and, you have a faceless system. Because land tax, obviously taxing the rich, they still need their people because the rich need their special privileges. So it's not until the 1920s that taxation of land becomes fully incorporated into this new faceless bureaucratic system. So that's my first example. My second example is the Ordnance Survey. Basically, state mapping. Again, this project begins with the Napoleonic Wars. So having said, this has got nothing to do with war, the state developing its capacities during war, I'm now giving you two examples of how the war is actually pretty important. First Ordnance Survey begins in 1791, and what it does is map out the coastland of Britain to protect it so it could be better protected from French invasion, which was obviously going to be by sea. It gets introduced in India in 1817 and in Ireland in 1824. And the key thing about the Ordnance Survey is it seems like the application of a new type of scientific approach, the science of cartography. By 1841, the Ordnance Survey Act gave this state body called the Ordnance Survey the power to do pretty remarkable things. It allowed it the power to collect and standardize place names. So Britain and Ireland is countries with enormous varieties of local dialects, where names of places would have been orally transmitted and could have been spelt in any number of different ways. The Ordnance Survey basically fixes how your locality was going to be known. That's the first thing it does. And that meant basically in Wales and Ireland and Scotland, the eradication of Gaelic or Celtic names. It also enabled the state to define and fix property and administrative boundaries. That's a pretty amazingly new thing to be able to do. And finally, and this is why I've given you this image, although I'm not sure that you can see it that well, it gave the Ordnance Survey the ability to make all public places visible, including their interior. So what you see in this image is actually the interior of the church and a bank in central Manchester. Like you can actually count how many pews are in that church. By 1892, England and Wales was being mapped on a scale large enough for the state to be able to determine the size of every doorstep, every front doorstep of every house. My final example here is going to be the census. Now we know that Britain was rather late into the census field, that America was in the vanguard. Britain doesn't get its first census until 1801, and what it does was provided a list of the address, the family size, the aggregate, family size, the age and occupation of of people. And critically, that census was collected by parish officers, i.e., the Anglican Church became the medium through which the state collected this knowledge of its local, of its population. That census, though, was nonetheless gave an official in London the ability to know how many people lived in what locality, however far away they may have been. And that was an unprecedented degree of knowledge that the centre had about the localities. In 1836, a new type of government office is created called the General Registrar's Office, the GRO, and it takes over responsibility for the running of the census. By 1841, it has 35,000 local enumerators doing the work of collecting returns. And importantly, the General Registrar's Office also takes something else away from the church, or rather, in addition to the church. Now, you have to register all births, deaths, and marriage with the state through this office. Up until this point, only the Anglican Church collected that information. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is not just that the state gets new data, or it has new forms of collecting that data, but that this data enables a different type of state. It enables the state to think and act in ways that it wasn't possible to do. And critically to that, it enabled this process of governing strangers that you didn't have to know. Now, this mapping of population and territory went hand in hand with the proliferation of statistics, the collection of statistics by the government to do, basically they counted pretty much everything they could think of, they could count. And again, just like the census, this statistical collection was about trying to gain knowledge of particular local activities and putting it into a general overview. Okay, so that you could abstract the knowledge of how many people died in a mine in South Wales and connect it to accounts of how many people died in mines right across the country. Okay, so now you're no longer dependent on a single individual to say, oh, well, in Abergavenny there's 5 people died this year. Now you have an overview knowledge of that entire process across the country. And what they did was they thought if they had that universal view of these processes, they would be able to discover the natural laws of population growth, of trade flows, of rates of crime, spreads of diseases, even the state of the military health of the population. Okay, so a whole number of things that before could only be comprehended in this local basis now became amenable to a new type of analysis and understanding. And key here was the growth of statistical knowledge and generally. You have in the 1830s a number of new types of statistical societies emerging. The first is in Manchester in 1833. The Royal Statistical Society in London is formed in 1834. And around that same time, you see the Board of Trade beginning to set up its own statistics department to measure flows of trade. You have a new type of electoral register counting the number of voters. And in 1834, you get a new type of poor law return, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then in 1836, the General Registrar's Office counting everybody and everything. Now, this type of knowledge enabled people like this man, Edwin Chadwick, to present themselves as having expert knowledge in particular fields. And government began to follow a common process. You would have an expert say, okay, I know all about public health, or I know all about I've studied the operation of the poor laws. We're going to set up a government commission that will collect all the information that we can. We'll have witnesses from around the country, etc., etc. And then we're going to pass legislation that will impose new types of regulations across the country as a whole. And then we're not going to stop there. We're going to create an inspectorate, a whole bunch of government inspectors that would then run around the country checking on the condition of mines, of factories, of the operation of the poor law, of the operation of sanitary laws, and eventually the implementation of education issues. All of these things were new from the 1830s onwards. Now, one thing that you'll begin to note is that all of these areas of work involved social issues, social problems. And one of the key things that this type of work did was to separate out these issues from economic issues. So, for instance, poverty and public health, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, are now considered to be issues not about the malfunctioning of the economy, but about social issues with their own internal dynamics and laws that could be operated to be perfected. What you'll also note is that these social problems invariably entailed the identification of individuals who had failed to become these ideal liberal subjects: the poor, the unsanitary, the ignorant. These are the people who become subject to these new types of government intervention. So, as I said, this massive extension of government power that begins to develop needs a new type of justification in the science of government, and it needs a new type of administrator. Okay, you could no longer have this new scientific approach operated by the old officials that were part of the system of old corruption, appointed by particular ministers or by the monarch, etc., etc. So, what happened was the development of what became known after the Northcote-Trevelyan report as the civil service. The idea that you could have government administrators that were independent from government. Civil servants that would operate the state regardless of the political point of view of the government in power. Okay? This is not a system that pertains so much in this country where every presidential election leads to a whole new population in Washington as all of their special advisors come in to do that work. In Britain, you have a permanent civil service that was set up at this point. Now, here's a key point in which the empire was the laboratory for these ideas, because the East India Company, in a way, at the heart of that old system of old corruption, the old mercantile institution, where Hastings had been flailed for his poor behavior by Burke. The East India Company had actually had something that anticipated this. It recruited and trained its officers. Okay, they were selected. It wasn't a competitive process of selection. They were, selected by personal connections and knowledge. But they were streamed into different elements of the administrative service by a competitive exam. So once in, they took exams that would decide what they were going to end up doing. And one of the key figures here is Charles Trevelyan, this rather dashing man that you'll be hearing more about on Thursday. His brother-in-law, Thomas Babington Macaulay, the famous historian who wrote a big 3-volume history about the history of England, published in 1848, had reformed the East India Company's administration in the 1830s. And Trevelyan had returned to India. He had a period of time in London, where you're going to see him on Thursday, managing the Irish famine. But after that, he goes back to India and introduces competitive exams for selection of the East India Company in 1852. Okay? And this was meant to be able to open up the administrative service to indigenous Indians, but the exams were conveniently held in London. So that was a pretty hard place to get to. The following year, in 1853, Trevelyan co-authors this report that you've been reading that says, okay, to have an independent civil service, to have a permanent and independent service, you have to give them clear salaries, you have to give them a job for life, so that they're not amenable to bribes, and you have to capture a certain type of administrator, a type of gentleman, ideally, a gentleman who could be trusted with the secrets of the state and who could be trusted to act in a disinterested public way. Now, in fact, the recommendations of the Northcote-Trevelyan report about open competition, about an open exam, aren't introduced until 1870. But these ideas are very important to the reform and restructuring of the civil service in the 1860s and the 1850s and the 1860s. It just so happens that what you do is create a new type of caste. So if the sons of the aristocrats and their patrons and their clients were part of the old corrupt system, now what you have is a new caste, which were Oxford and Cambridge educated gentlemen, primarily educated in the liberal arts and primarily classics. So in 1914, the very elite part of that civil service, the first division administrators, 78% of them came from Oxford and Cambridge, and 60% of them had read classics. These were the masters of the universe who could survey all types of knowledge. Underneath them were about 6,000 specialists, engineers, people like inspectors who would go around with expert professional knowledge like chemists and engineers, those types of people. And then underneath them you would have about 3,000 junior clerks whose job was to basically shift paper. So you have basically the recreation of a class society within the very structure of the state, of a sort of gentlemanly aristocracy, but now mandated by an Oxbridge education, specialist, middle-class professionals, and then the clerks, the sort of effectively the manual labourers of the state. And here you see a great image of them at work in the 1890s in a giant room. Boy clerks, most of them were boys, and they were thrown out at age 20 unless they passed an exam that enabled them to become a permanent civil servant. Now, the problem with hiring these types of people, processing all of that data that they were getting from all of those statistics and all of those government officers and inspectors all around the country, was that suddenly these people, these basically effectively, lower middle class clerks, were now trusted with the secrets of the state. And the issue was, could you have the key data of the government passing through these types of people? So what they do in 1911 is introduce the Official Secrets Act, because it's at that point that they believe that the idea of honourable secrecy, that gentlemen and people trained in a gentlemanly way would keep the state secrets to themselves, no longer seemed to be held true because of the scale of the data and the scale of the people they had to employ. Right. You can stop writing now because I'm just going to show you a bunch of pretty pictures for a little bit. This leads to the transformation of the centre of government, Whitehall. This is Trafalgar Square. At the top of it, I've turned these images around. At the top here you have Trafalgar Square. Up there you have the Houses of Parliament. Okay, this is Whitehall. This is the heart of the government machine in London. Here you see an image in 1764. You'll note that these whole network of streets basically gets eradicated in the middle of the 19th century. And this area here becomes the so-called Victoria Embankment. They basically fill in the Thames to be able to house all of these new government offices, which included new Scotland Yard. So in other words, what I'm saying is this collection of all of this data, this hiring of all of these people, required the creation of a whole new material infrastructure to house these people and to represent the authority of the state. So all the big government departments that you would see if you drove down Whitehall or walked down Whitehall were all built in the second half of the 19th century. The Victoria Embankment came in 1870. The removal of these extra things in King Street and Parliament Square came in 1873. Then you had the Home and Colonial Office built in the 1870s, New Scotland Yard in the 1880s, the Admiralty extensions with Admiralty Arch in the 1890s, and the Treasury in 1898, the War Office in 1899, and so on and so on. And Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives, which I think is this street here, became the official residence of the Prime Minister in 1885. What these buildings did was project, not just hold the bureaucratic space of the state, they projected the authority. This is the Houses of Parliament, rebuilt in Gothic style after a fire had destroyed the old Houses of Parliament in 1834, and it's built in this historical style to try and summon up the idea that English democracy isn't actually invented in the 1830s as it was, but stretched all the way back to the deep medieval past. Then the Houses of Parliament becomes the site for a whole new set of ceremonies, of state ceremonies, like the opening, the monarchical opening of the Houses of Parliament. You see here Queen Victoria at the state opening of Parliament in 1852, a new ceremony invented by the Victorian monarchy. You see here the Foreign Office, the grandeur of the Foreign Office. There was a huge argument about whether they build this in classical style or in Gothic style, whether it should be something indigenous, supposedly in the Gothic style, or ape the imperial splendor of ancient Rome. And as you see, the classical style eventually wins out with the Treasury in the 1890s, and here, my favorite building, the War Office, built in the first 5 years of the 20th century. This building has over 1,000 offices and 2.5 miles of corridor. I mean, it really is a phenomenal space. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this new type of bureaucratic machine that is the state also has this profoundly symbolic role in the heart of London. Now, I'm going to try and put some flesh on all of these rather abstract bones by talking about 2 case studies, so you can see how these new structures of government actually work in practice. And I'm going to talk about the new Poor Law first, and then I'm going to talk about the introduction of public health measures. Before I do that, I should emphasize that these are both measures and systems introduced in Britain. There are a plethora of new systems that are introduced in many colonial settings. The rationalization of taxation systems, of property law, of penal systems, of educational systems. I could give you many examples of those happening basically around the same type of time in places like India and Ireland especially. I'm not going to do that, partly because I don't have enough time, partly because the ways in which those systems get introduced are, even though they look often like similar systems, they're introduced in radically different types of ways. And one of the reasons why they look radically different is because, well, two reasons. One is they have to be designed in a way that is seen to be appropriate for colonial subjects who are less developed and less civilized. And they are implemented in radically different ways, often far more coercive ways, because there is no representative system. They have to be answerable to no one in the same type of way as you'll see they have to be in Britain. Nonetheless, with these two examples, the New Poor Law and the public health, Britain actually comes first. So Ireland doesn't get its poor law until 1837, whereas Britain gets its in 1834. India never gets one for reasons that will become apparent in a later lecture. And public health measures are again happen later in Ireland and very, very much later in India. And we're talking the 1870s and 1880s as opposed to the 1840s. So let's move on to the first one of these case studies, the New Poor Law. And I'm sure in your coffee house discussions in sections you will have addressed Malthus's view on poor relief. Okay? Malthus was fiercely opposed to the poor laws. He basically saw them as generating, not ending, dependence. They allowed paupers to basically supplement their wages and was a deterrent to true industrious and independent behaviour. Jeremy Bentham is also very interested in the poor laws. Everybody in late 18th century Britain is interested in the poor laws because poverty has become, and the drain of local taxes on poor relief seemed to be so important. Bentham wanted to develop a more efficient, a more rational system of relief. And it's in many ways the Benthamite vision that wins out, not least because the key architect of the New Poor Law was Edwin Chadwick, and Edwin Chadwick was a pal of Jeremy Bentham. So the New Poor Law, the Reform Poor Law that is finally introduced in 1834, and introduced in the very same pattern, i.e. the holding of a commission, the Poor Law Commission, the suggestion of legislation, the passing of legislation, the creation of a central commission that would then regulate the operation, and the introduction of inspectors. All of these things happen with the New Poor Law for the first time. What it does is try and make poor relief a deterrent. Okay, so it's a more punitive disciplinary system. And its aim is to try and make the poor industrious, liberal individuals, people who can do the work to look after themselves. And in doing that, you can see that what it does is says, well, look, poverty is not about the inability of the market to provide people work or provide people good enough wages to be able to live on. Poverty is about the individual moral failing of the pauper. The pauper lacks the moral character and the self-discipline to be able to support themselves. So to solve this problem, what they came up with was the abolition of so-called outdoor relief, where under the old system you could be given a supplement to your wages or simply poor relief to continue to live in your home with your family. Instead, what you had was the creation of a new type of incarceration in a workhouse, what became known as a workhouse, where the sexes were segregated, families were broken up, and the conditions within the workhouse, as you can tell from your reading, and I hope you get through that piece because it's terrific, are less eligible. where you had to create less eligible conditions than those outside. In other words, you had to make the conditions inside the workhouse an active deterrent for people wanting to claim poor relief. So the second key element about the new poor law is its design. Okay? Not just the new type of ideology that it's projecting upon the poor, but the way in which the system operated. So as I said, you have the Central Poor Law Commission, and what it does was take away poor relief from the church. The Anglican Church and parishes had been the basis for the distribution of poor relief in the Elizabethan Poor Law that ran up to 1834. Now, what Chadwick and his commissioners did was create a new administrative unit known as the local union, a poor law union, that collapsed several parishes often together and created a new figure who would administer that space, the poor law guardian. Now, guardians had to own their own property or be magistrates until 1894. And it was only after 1894 that those qualifications were removed and anyone could be elected a poor law guardian. But the key point was that these guardians were elected officials. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to get here is you have a new centralized system where the Central Poor Law Commission at the heart of Whitehall can say, okay, this is the conditions you have to have in your workhouses. Okay, these are the regulations. We have the inspectors that are going to come around and check how much you're feeding them, how much you're making them work, you know, whether you're segregating them, etc., etc., etc. But the implementation of those central regulations is delegated to locally elected officials. Okay, so when I said at the very beginning there's a dialectic of centralization, but then a reanimation of local structures, this is a good example of that. And obviously, the election of poor law guardians becomes quite heated. The other way in which you can think about centralization is in the actual design of the workhouses themselves that were based around Bentham's very idea of a panopticon, of having a centralized space that could view and monitor and survey the activities of people right across the system. And it took a variety of different forms. In prisons like this, this is Strangeways Prison in Manchester, you can see very clearly there's a central observation tower. You could have buildings like this, or more usually, you could have layouts like this, where like H-block buildings basically, which became a big deal, where every ward was easily accessible to the people who worked there. By 1860, 60% of poor law unions had built new workhouses to incarcerate the poor, but only 60%. And so it's on the slide that I can't see because I can't turn my head. And the other key element here is that despite this new type of central power, local election meant that by the 1890s, 76% of poor law unions were still providing outdoor relief. They're still doing the very thing that the new poor law set up in 1834 to eradicate. Often because they hadn't built a workhouse, or the workhouse that they'd built was simply not big enough to hold all the paupers under their charge. Okay, my next example. Public health. Edwin Chadwick has got his, I shouldn't say dirty little hands, because I'm sure they were impeccably clean and sanitary. But Chadwick is a key figure here, and this is why, again, I'm trying to draw these parallels between the poor law and the introduction of public health. Chadwick writes this famous report on sanitary conditions using new forms of social observation, social reporting, and statistics. And what he does is then, just as he had with the Poor Law, become like the expert on sanitary measures. He becomes a key part of the Health of Towns Commission set up by the government in 1844, and then that leads to recommendations, some of which are implemented in the Public Health Act of 1848. Now, the sanitary conditions of the urban industrializing areas were grotesque. The environmental pollution of industrialization, the degree of poverty, of slum housing, of open sewers, of no running waters. Britain was unsanitary horror, and mortality rates were very high in cities as a consequence. So sanitation was a big issue. But again, what Chadwick does was detach those sanitary conditions from an understanding of their relationship to economic life. Instead, again, sanitation became something that was primarily about urban design, the unplanned nature of urban design, or about the failings of individual moral character. Only the truly illiberal, unpleasant, abject individuals could live in these types of sanitary conditions. So you can see from this quote from Chadwick's report on sanitary conditions, the removal of noxious physical circumstances and the promotion of civic, household and personal cleanliness are necessary to the improvement of the moral condition of the people. There's a direct correlation between sanitary condition and whether you are a good moral person. To be free in this sense was to be sanitary. And to be unsanitary, to be dirty, smelly, was to be a moral evil that required active government intervention. So again, the same system is introduced as with the Poor Law. You have a new Board of Health established, and then the formation of local boards of health. Okay? This was set up by the legislation of 1848, but local boards of health were only set up if 10% of the local population asked for one. Okay? So it was an adoptive, a voluntary measure. You had to choose to buy in, unless your local death rate exceeded 23 per thousand. If your death rate exceeded that amount, you had no option. The state would insist you would have a local board of health. And basically, in the 1860s and 1870s, that voluntary framework becomes more tenuous, and more forms of compulsion are introduced. In 1866, the Sanitary Act, the Public Health Act, basically makes those local boards of health responsible for the building and the provision of sewers, underground sewers, of provision of clean water and of street cleaning, and insisted that all houses had to be connected to the sewer system. So one of the key things that happens in 19th century cities is the big construction of this new type of sanitary infrastructures, of drains and sewers, of reservoirs that were going to provide clean water, of public urinals, like the one you see before you, of discreet burial places, of abattoirs out of the sight of the street, the widening and lighting of streets, the prevention of noise, the measuring of air quality, etc., etc. All of these things became under the rubric of the public health measures. Yes? This would be paid partly by grant from central government, but mainly through local taxation. Okay? So the construction of every reservoir, for instance, was obviously a heated thing, not just because of the environmental impact on the valleys flooded, but also the issue of payment. Now, the last thing that I wanted to say about this is that what this did was create a new environment, if you like, in which one had to perform being sanitary, that new standards and codes of behavior were created. So I'm going to give you the example of urinating because it's my favorite. Still to this very day, my people are immensely fond of urinating on the street in public places. Okay, despite over 150 years of being told that they have to go into what we here call urinals, but what in England we call urinals. The point is, after the beginning of the spread of public, and now I'm confused what I have to say, urinals, it became increasingly unacceptable to be seen to be urinating in the street or in a public place. Okay? And it was absolutely unacceptable to do it in the park. You'd be chased around the park by the park keeper. That created a new code of behavior and a new type of regulation in which it wasn't simply the state, the police or the park inspector or whoever it was that would be chasing people that were peeing in public places. The sense of condemnation came from you, came from the understanding that the rest of society had that it was no longer acceptable to pee in a public place. So this is a very, very good example of the way in which rule becomes internalized by people. That state action that seems disinterested and scientific actually inculcates new ways for people to behave. It helps propagate, if you like, this new type of ideal liberal person. Deep breath. Actually, it's probably best not to take a deep breath in this room with no windows. I'm sure that Edwin Chadwick would have something quite horrible to say about the sanitary conditions of this room. If any of you get a virus or get the flu that is going around everywhere in the next few days, please make a point of not coming to class, because I suspect if you did, we'd all be sick the following week. Anyway, so let me just wrap up what I've been trying to say. I've been trying to say, look, that a new type of modern state emerges in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century. And it came from two places. It came from the first place from having to solve a new problem, which was the problem of governing in a society of strangers, governing when you don't know the people that you have to rule over. And that this creates a new centralized, bureaucratic form of state authority. That was the first impetus. The second was that enlightened, radical critique of old corruption, of the inefficient, wasteful, expensive nature of a state that depended upon administrators who were placed there by their patrons. And in their place, you get the emergence of this idea of a new disinterested, objective science of government that was beyond politics, beyond the interest of individuals. This, I'm suggesting, enabled Britons to trust the state, trust the enormous incursions into their everyday life that the state was increasingly making. And I've been suggesting that there was something of a hierarchy in the way in which the application of government in everyday life occurred. So, if you met the standards of being a good liberal person, you were sanitary, you were industrious, you supported your family, you read your newspaper, you kept yourself informed, then largely the state left you alone, although, as we can see with the case of the urinal, that there would be new environments that would enable you to propagate good sanitary habits and good reading habits and many other things that will come across in future lectures. Basically, you were promised to be left alone by the state. On the other hand, if you were one of those people who failed to be a good liberal person, if you were thought to be lazy or indigent, if you were a bad moral character, if you were dirty, if you were ignorant, if you were a criminal, the full force of the state, very often in the new forms of incarceration that occurred around prisons, workhouses, schools, etc., 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 became the place for you. And so you have the irony that this new type of liberal state wants to make people free, wants to emancipate people, but it does so by actually giving them more government. So liberalism that I'm talking about is not the absence of government. It's not about making the state small. It's about the proliferation of government, and proliferation of government in all areas of social life. But, again, I don't want you to think of this as simply a one-way street. I've been trying to emphasize, and particularly with the example of the Poor Law and local sanitary measures, that often the way in which these were introduced was by creating local representative structures. You had this strong central component, but then you had these local systems, local structures that enabled local people to be part of its administration. Okay, so local government, the personal authority of people in localities, whether it is the JP, the magistrate, or the Poor Law guardian, or even the sanitary inspector, continued to be hugely important. So for many people, the state was not this faceless bureaucratic machine, but actually was someone that they still encountered, albeit in different ways, as a human being. Now, on Thursday, what I'm going to look at is how the new science of political economy does a very similar thing to the nature of economic life itself. And so we'll look at the development of ideas of the free market and how they come to help fashion a new type of liberal person as well. Thank you for your patience.